Good morning. The Bible reading this morning will be from Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 5. And there are gathered together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, and had seen that some of his disciples ate their bread with defiled, that is, unwashen hands. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands diligently, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, except they bathe themselves, they eat not. And many other things there are, which they have received to hold, washing of cups and pots and brassen vessels. And the Pharisees and the scribes ask him, Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with defiled hands?
The Gospel of Mark, as I've mentioned many times this year, is all about what it means to be a child of God, to be a Christian. The Gospel of Mark was written to Christian people to remind them what they had become and how that was supposed to affect their life. Mark doesn't use the word Christian in the book. Instead, Mark chooses to use the word follower or disciple. And Mark says early in the book that there are three components to being a disciple of Jesus. The first one is unending, undying dedication. Jesus is not our first priority. He is our only priority. And if you think about that, you may think, well, what about my husband? What about my wife? What about my children? What about my parents? Aren't they supposed to have priority? The point is that they have their place solely because Jesus has first priority. He determines your actions and your feelings toward them because He is first. And Jesus in Mark chapter 8 says these words, If anyone would be my disciple, your Bible may have there, if anyone would follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So here we stop just a moment and ask, what did Jesus mean by this business of taking up your cross? If that's what it means to follow Jesus, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Well, one reply generally is that if it means to die for Jesus, then that's what you ought to do. Another one is if you meet a challenge in life and it sets you back a little bit, well, you're supposed to meet it with the confidence that Jesus has. But I'm unconvinced of either of those. I think that generally both of those are true, but it's not what Jesus means. Because Jesus doesn't give you the option. He doesn't say, if you meet a difficulty, pick up that cross and follow me, do what I would do. Jesus says, if you're going to follow me, pick up a cross. What are you going to do if you pick up a cross? You're going to die. And I think that's what Jesus has in mind here, is that all that I have become through the influence of my world and my own thinking and the things that I've been exposed to, all that I am, and I kind of like me, that all of that's supposed to be put to death. Why? Because instead of that, Jesus wants to live in your life. And Jesus doesn't give you the option. He says, this must take place. He goes on to say, whoever would save his life, whoever wants to keep his life just like it is because I like my life, whoever wants to keep his life just like it is will lose it. But whoever will lose his life, be willing to give up that for the gospel's sake and for my sake, that person will save his life as Jesus would have it. Mark says there's something else. You must also be a partaker of Jesus' life. You must make His teachings and His example your guide for living. Paul speaks to both of these in Galatians 20 when Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. That's that taking up the cross business. I have been crucified with Christ. Crucifixion is a slow death. Paul's saying, I have slowly put to death who it is that I am. I am crucified with Christ, and yet I'm still alive. I didn't die physically, but it's not me who's living. What's living? It is Christ who lives in me, And the life that I now live, I live by the faith of the one who loved me. Please notice, Paul does not say, the life that I now live, I live by faith in the one who loved me. He says, I live by the faith of the one who loved me. Who is the one who loved him? Jesus. And what's Paul got in mind here? The same faith Jesus had has become my faith, and it is now being expressed in my life. Paul goes on to say in Philippians, he said, it's my earnest expectation and hope that Christ will be exalted by my body, whether by my life or by my death. It's this particular passage in the Old King James Bible that I love much more, because there, Paul writes, it is my earnest expectation and hope that Christ will be magnified in my body. What's the point? The point is that I can read about Jesus on the page, and I can get an idea of Jesus from the page. But where that comes to life is where it becomes a part of my life. And people see not just the writing on the page, but they see the evidence of it in my life. Christ is magnified. Christ is exalted. And then Mark says that if we're going to be a disciple of Jesus, we have to share the message of Jesus with others. And that brings me to why this message of Mark and discipleship is so important. I've said this before. You cannot convince people to be disciples of Jesus if you yourself are not a disciple of Jesus. But I want to change that this morning. I don't want to take anything away from it, but I do want to change it. You can't convince, and the reason I want to change it is because it becomes virtually impossible. You can't lead somebody to Christ unless you yourself are following Jesus. Yeah, but the problem with that is that I mess up. I often don't follow Jesus. And since I have so much trouble with this, that relieves me of my responsibility, or I can consider myself to be an ineffective evangelist of other people simply because I find that living the life of Jesus so hard. So that's why I've changed it. You cannot convince people to follow Jesus if they cannot see that you are trying to follow Jesus. And it is the trying that is key. You see, I try to follow Jesus, and I mess up. When I mess up, I don't give up, and I don't walk away, and I don't say, well, I just can't do this anymore. I get up, I dust myself off, I ask God for forgiveness, I ask God for strength, and I hit it again. And when I fail again, I dust myself off, pick myself up, ask God for forgiveness and strength, and I hit it again. And what do people see? They see this guy who keeps trying and who keeps failing, but he keeps trying, and they're liable to ask, why in the world do you beat yourself up over this? And why do we do it? Because it's important. Because that's what Jesus has called us to. And when they ask us, why do you keep beating yourself up over this? Why do you keep trying like this? Why do you agonize over this? I can tell them why. And having heard why it's important and having seen that it is important in my life, it emboldens them to maybe make it important in their life too. Example is a really big deal. And Mark gives us 3 examples in his book that stand out. The first, of course, is Jesus. I'm going to follow Jesus. But the second example is that of his disciples. Now think with me about this for a moment. I can't talk a lot about the disciples this morning because I really have that third group I need to talk about. The disciples are not religious people, right? When Jesus meets Peter and he calls Peter to come follow him, Peter replies on one occasion, "Get away from me, Lord, I'm a what? I'm a sinner. I'm a sinful man. I'm rough. I'm tough. I'm a fisherman. I say what's on my mind. Yeah, you don't want me. Oh, yeah, I want you, Peter." So you have the disciples who aren't religious. They don't even know how to pray, at least to some extent, because they come to Jesus and say, "Lord, teach us how to pray." There's something lacking in our prayer life. So these are people who are not religious people, but what can you say about them? You could say that they try. You could say that they fail. You can say that they pick themselves up and come to Jesus again and ask for forgiveness. And what does Jesus do? He takes them right back. And by the way, if you didn't catch it, that's where our two themes this year meet. Okay? It's in Jesus. Jesus loves us the way we should love one another. When people come back to Jesus, Jesus forgives, and they walk together again. That's the way we should do it, but that's another lesson for another time. I just want you to see that these two themes do indeed go together. And the disciples keep on trying. But the third example that Mark gives us is that of Jesus' opponents. And unlike Jesus' disciples, the opponents are religious people. What do we say about the disciples? They're not religious, right? But what about his opponents? Oh, they are religious people. They are dedicated religious people. They believe that they stand right before God. But what are they not? They are not disciples of Jesus. Do you see the difference? The difference is in their discipleship. And this morning I want to turn to the opponents of Jesus so that you can see a little bit from their example. One of the things that ought to strike us when we read about Jesus' opponents is how petty they can be. As Mark opens up, Jesus casts out demons, he heals the sick, he cleanses lepers. All that's in chapter 1. In chapter 2, Jesus has a paralyzed man that Jesus restores and makes him whole. And it's right there where you meet for the first time Jesus' critics. The critics are the scribes. Some versions have there the teachers of the law. These are the fellows who've studied the Bible. They've gone to school. They are theologians. They've got their PhD in theology. Nothing wrong with PhDs in theology unless you want to live like these guys. And then there is something wrong with it. These guys know the law. But they turn on Jesus. When Jesus heals that paralyzed man, they forget all about the power that's been exhibited here in healing people and in healing lepers and casting out demons, and they hang on one little phrase. Jesus said to him, what? Your sins are forgiven, right? And then they go, oh my goodness, we can't be having this. And all the good that Jesus had done goes out the window because Jesus violated some sense of propriety that they had. They had it. It was them. And the problem was them. It was who they were. They focused on minutia. What if Jesus couldn't really forgive the guy's sins? What difference did it make, really? Do you really think that somebody in the grip of Satan would cast out Satan? Really? And yet that's what Jesus does. How could he possibly be in the grip of Satan? How could this be wrong? Give him the benefit of the doubt and move on, but they will not. They're hanging on that one thing, and they turn against Jesus. After the scribes confront Jesus, then you have the scribes and the Pharisees confronting Jesus. The scribes knew how to live. The Pharisees lived it. That's the difference between the two. The Pharisees lived the law minutely. And then the third opposition to Jesus is just Pharisees. And the fourth opposition of Jesus is the Pharisees and the Herodians. Wow. The Pharisees are the devoutly religious people. The Herodians are the devoutly nationalistic people. And here you have the religious and the patriotic coming together, both of who they are. And what do they end up doing? Opposing Jesus. Exactly right. They stand in opposition to Jesus. What are they so upset about? Well, they're upset because Jesus doesn't teach what they teach. Jesus doesn't teach like they teach. Jesus' focus is different. Jesus is focused on changing people's lives and getting people to turn from their sins. But his detractors, his opponents, the religious people, cared nothing about helping people turn from their sins or turn their lives around or change their lives for the better. They didn't care about that. They only cared about what? Themselves and keeping the status quo. They just wanted to keep things the way that they were. And all of that brings us to Mark 7. In Mark 7, at meal with Jesus, they observe that the disciples of Jesus do not wash their hands before they eat. It's not even that they don't wash their hands. It is, and Aaron, I forgot what your reading was a moment ago. I think you were probably reading from the NIV. But what did you read there? In verse 3. You could yell it out. In verse 3, the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands diligently, and the ESV has, except they wash their hands properly. Okay? It doesn't say that the disciples didn't eat with washed hands, just they didn't observe the way in which it ought to be done. Now, it may have been that there was some biblical foundation for this business of washing hands, but I assure you it had nothing to do with sanitation. Chances are it was something like this. In the Old Testament, the priests had to wash before they went into the tabernacle to eat the showbread. If they had washed, then we ought to think about washing as well before we go and eat, because we might have touched something unclean, or heaven forbid, we might have touched some Gentile, and now I've touched my food, and I've eaten the food, and now I got Gentileness inside me, okay? And that makes me impure before God, and we look at that and we laugh. But if we think about it, we might think of our own religious shibboleths that at times are equally inane. Jesus says, how could you be so stupid? That's not what he says, but that's what he means. He says, don't you see that what goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him, since it doesn't go into his heart? Instead, it goes into his what? His stomach. And then out it goes, right? So it just passes right through you. That can't defile you. That can't affect you before God. But what you have done is you have made your tradition law. And it is keeping you from God. Let me share with you 3 things about tradition. I want you to understand that I'm not opposed to tradition. I'll be back to that in a minute. But 3 things you ought to be careful about when it comes to tradition, particularly when it has to do with our walk with Jesus. Number 1, tradition often diminishes the law of God. It speaks where God doesn't exactly speak. You've heard this? Well, I know that's, I can't show you where that is in the Bible, but I'm sure it's there. Why are you sure it's there? Because that's what I've always heard. That's what we've always done. And that's what I'm comfortable with. In other words, that's who I am. What did Jesus say? Kill who you are. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in you following me. And whatever gets in your way has to be put to death. And so Jesus refers to this. Jesus says, you people, Isaiah spoke well of you when he said, these people honor me with their lips and with their mouth, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for teaching the commandments of men. And then Jesus picks one of them that they do. Jesus says, the law said, honor your father and your mother. And what does that mean? Well, it means you take care of mom and dad. What does that mean? It means that if they need a place to live, you provide it. It means that if they need food, you buy it and give it to them. If it means that if they need medical care, you see that they get it. It's your responsibility. You honor father and mother. Have you ever known people who didn't do that? I have. I've known people who wouldn't even show up at their parents' funeral. There's no honor there. And there were people in Jesus' day who did the same thing, but they still wanted to believe that they were righteous. So how can I do that and not give mom and dad any care? Oh, I know how I'll do it. I'll create a trust, and I'll put everything I own in the trust, and I'll dedicate the trust to the Lord. And the priest will know that this, if I die, all of my stuff, all of my money, it goes to the temple. It goes to the Lord. Now, what I'm hoping is what? That I'm not going to die, right? That I'm going to outlive mom and dad. But I put all of this money in trust, and when mom and dad need help, I can say, I'm sorry, I wish I could help you, but I've given all of my money to the Lord. I've put it all in the trust. And what I'm hoping is that mom and dad will kick off. And now I can go pay 30 shekels or 60 shekels of silver, and I get all my trust back. You see how that works? And therefore, I have gotten by the taking care of mom and dad. But I've done so in a way that has nothing to do with Scripture. And Jesus says that's what you've done. Your traditions have trumped the law of God. But the second thing that tradition often does is it gives you a false sense of security. By focusing on things that God doesn't really talk about, it keeps you from focusing on things that God says. The Pharisees could focus on washing your hands properly, but they didn't focus on helping people who were in need. And it kept them from focusing on evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. Jesus says it's what comes out of the heart that defiles the person. It is those evil thoughts. It is wickedness. It is deceit. It is sensuality. It's envy. It's slander. It's pride. It's foolishness. I've got all of that going, or some of that going in my life. But oh, yes, I wash my hands right. But washing your hands does not make you right before the Lord. The third thing the traditions did was to keep people from influencing the lives of the ones Jesus came to save. The traditions of outward purity kept the faithful away from folks with bleeding issues. It kept them away from folks with disease like leprosy. It kept them away from sin issues. Remember, Jesus goes to the household of the Pharisee, and the woman comes in, washes Jesus' feet, and the Pharisee says, I wouldn't let her touch me, right? It's that attention to tradition that keeps you away from the very people Jesus came to save. And yet, from the first chapter of Mark all the way to the 7th chapter and beyond, those are exactly the people Jesus has been ministering to. Jesus' disciples struggled with living like Jesus because they, like us, found living like Jesus difficult. But Jesus' opponents refused to follow Jesus because they found His way not difficult, but different. And they had no willingness whatsoever to change the way that they lived. The temptation for us, I believe, is to say, I like who I am, and I like Jesus, and I want to accept Jesus, but I also want to stay who I am. That's the temptation. And Jesus says, it's absolutely impossible. You're going to fail. Jesus says this early on in Mark. He says it in chapter 2. Jesus says, nobody takes a piece of unshrunk cloth and uses it to patch an old pair of pants or an old robe, because that's shrunk cloth. And when you put unshrunk cloth on shrunk cloth and you wash it, what happens to the unshrunk cloth? It shrinks, and that makes the hole bigger, and it tears up the patch, and it tears up the garment even worse. Jesus says you can't put new wine in old wineskins, because when you put new wine in old wineskins, the new wine ferments, and the old wineskins can't handle the stretch, and they break, and you ruin the wine, and you ruin the wineskin. You cannot meld together the way of Jesus and the way of the world. You cannot meld together the way of Jesus and the way that you're comfortable. Jesus says you've got to simply and solely follow me. I said not all traditions are bad. They aren't. 20 years after Jesus died, Paul wrote these words. So then, brothers, stand fast and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, whether by word or whether by letter. And don't think Jesus is using, Paul's using a different word for tradition here. He's not. It's not a different kind of tradition. Traditions are traditions because we've lived that way for a long time. We've practiced this thing for a long time. And when Paul talks about the traditions that he had delivered, what he's saying is this is not the traditions of your ancestors. This is the way of life that Christ has set before you. And it is traditional because you've been living it such a very long time. That's the tradition we want. We want the tradition of the life of Christ living in us so that following Jesus is our tradition. Bill, would you lead us in a song? Let's stand and sing.